The following interview segment was taken from Talking Wealth on flix.net. That's FLIXX.net. Talking Wealth is brought to you by Wealth Within and presented by Dale Gillham and Janine Cox. To watch the full episode, go to flix.net, click on the On Demand section, and then click on Talking Wealth under the Finance section. Or for more information, visit wealthwithin.com.au. Today we have Eric Brotman, Certified Financial Planner and author of the book, Don't Retire, Graduate. Back on Talking Wealth to share his wisdom again with you. Eric Brotman, welcome back to Talking Wealth. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Dale. Thank you so much for having me back.
Look, I've missed you. We haven't talked for ages. And I just love it when we chat and I'm thinking, when's Eric coming back? And so I'm glad to have you back today on the show.
I'm glad to be here. Absolutely.
Now, today we're going to get into what I would classify as a very important topic, and it's an area that I know many, if not most people ignore, which is to their detriment. And we're actually going to be chatting about preparing for the next bear market. So, and that's for people under 50, and you've got some age brackets that you want to talk about. So I'm going to leave it open to you, and Janine and I will add some comments around that.
Yeah, no, I think we've forgotten. We have very short memories. And, you know, the great financial crisis that was now almost 13 years ago when it started feels like ancient history. And in fact, there's now a whole generation of investors who don't remember it at all.
Correct.
So it's a very interesting thing. And you couple that with the fact that at least in the US, we're seeing inflation now for the first time in almost 30 years. And that combination, that there are full generations who don't know what to do with those kind of circumstances. And so hopefully they'll be turning to advisors or at least those folks who are more senior than they are to learn a little bit. I think preparing for bear markets really does depend on not just your age, but your stage in terms of the path to financial independence. I mean, how far along are you? If you're early career or even mid-career, most of the time you sort of have your head down and you're looking at ways to put money away, and a bear market can strangely be really good for you. I'm not saying we're rooting for it. I'm just saying for folks in their 20s or 30s or even 40s, most of the time, if markets go straight up, every time you buy something, you're buying it at a more expensive price than you did the month before or the year before. If there's volatility and if you stick to your guns, it can actually be to your benefit. It can be accretive because you're buying every dip, even if you're not doing it on purpose. None of us can time it. Yeah. But your behavior can control the outcome significantly when you're an active buyer.
So you're saying for someone who's younger, these big dips like what we've seen with the COVID, what we saw with the GFC, if they're starting out after those dips or around the time of those dips, then for them it gives them a huge advantage, is what you're saying. Absolutely.
And even if they started 5 years before a dip, remember that a dip like that, even if it's 30 or 40%, like we saw back in 08, 09, the steeper it is, the scarier it gets, the more opportunistic it becomes for people who have the stomach for it. You know, I think it was Warren Buffett who said, I like to be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. That is the simplest advice in the world. And as soon as people start running for the exits, it's time to go in.
I think for young people, just on that, I think for young people, you know, it's better for them if they actually experience it at that point, obviously when they're young, because then they can put plans in place to do something different for future ones that might happen. But to your point, what happens is people of 13 years on, people have forgotten about it. And and it's not just the generation of people who are coming on now, it's actually people who are older, who I'm looking at, all they're focused on is what they're making right now because the market's up. And they've almost forgotten what had happened before and not factoring that into their behaviour.
I've read a lot about the behavioral finance decisions made by folks who survived the Depression in the late 20s, early 30s, which shockingly is almost 100 years ago now.
Yeah, right.
I feel like I might be 100 years old. I'm not, so I wasn't here for that, but I have read about it. And, you know, people were scarred by that and never actually changed their behaviors. It was so severe that they really made decisions around what was valuable, what was important, what was tangible, what was real for the rest of their lives. In the last 100 years, other than that, we've not seen that. So even 08, 09, the recovery was was relatively swift. I mean, within 5 years, it's as if nothing happened.
That's in the US.
That's true. That's true. And since we work primarily with U.S. investors in this country, it was almost like nothing happened. And we have the shortest memories here ever. And that was before everyone started just using YouTube and TikTok. Now, the attention span has gotten much shorter. But for investors, having the stomach and having the strategy to dollar cost average and to keep doing it no matter what happens, and literally put blinders on, ignore the news du jour. Because it will pass, it will change. And so for young people, the best thing that can happen actually in the long run is some volatility.
Yeah, I know.
That changes when you get a little older though.
Yes.
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And I know, I mean, when we had the GFC, it was basically 20 years after the 87 crash. So people lived through that. I mean, I lived through that, and obviously you did, and Janine probably didn't. She's too young for that to remember it all. But we saw people do that. In 2007, I know Janine and I were out there at big investment expos. We were keynote speaking. We were doing all sorts of presentations telling people to get prepared for the next bear market. And this was in 2006. We said, it's coming. We've had this long bull market. The longer it goes up, it's like going up a seesaw. Eventually you get to the apex and it goes the other way. So if you don't plan for it, it's going to happen to you.
And we could see young people mortgaging themselves to the hilt, getting brand new everything. You know, it's not like in the older days where, you'd save for fridges, you'd buy things brand new when you could. It's just like, let's just buy everything now on credit and have the big house, the big movie rooms, all of that, just like our parents have.
But it was borrowing to invest as well. There was a lot of borrowing to invest. We met financial journalists that took all their money out of their house that they could possibly get and throw it into the market. And, this was in, late 2006, and I was having lunch with them, and I go, why are you doing that? And then they lost because they thought it was going to go up forever. But I remember the year after, in 2008, we were at a major investment expos, and all these people that had saw us the year before going, wow, you were right. I said, it's not about whether I'm right. What did you do?
Yeah.
And they go, I lost all my money. Should I stay in the market now or get out? And I go, no, now you get in.
Right, you got to stay.
It's to the opposite, which is what Buffett talks about. But, as you said, people do not learn from the past where they should. So somebody who's who's a young person, obviously they can go through these dips and then, as you're saying, buy into them, which we 100% agree with. But what about somebody moving in towards retirement age? What should they be doing?
There are really only three kinds of people out there in the markets. There's buyers, holders, and sellers. And buyers we've talked about. The folks who are in their, say, 50s to 70s, where they're maybe still working, maybe at full clip, maybe they're making huge incomes, or maybe they're slowing down, and we're all different. But there is definitely a date on the horizon, or an idea on the horizon, where financial independence is important, and you're looking to not have to punch a clock anymore. Even if it's for yourself, there's a point where if work is optional, it feels better. And the closer you get to that, the more tempting it is to try and push the pedal and get there faster. It's almost like the last, I hear marathoners say, if you try and push that last mile, too fast, you can actually burn out half a mile from the finish because you feel like, oh, I'm so close, I just want to finish it. What we tell folks in those scenarios to do is to treat every account a little bit differently. So for example, if you've got a retirement plan through work and you're adding every check, you're a buyer. Whether you're 20 or 50, you're a buyer. So where you're adding every check or every month, you still can take some of that risk of a dip because you still have time to work with it. But if you have other accounts that are parked, that are just sitting, any downturn in those accounts, it's going to take a long time to recover. It could be 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and you lose a lot of ground. So if you're going to have a balanced portfolio and you're going to have some risk, but you're also going to have some security, try to put the security in the places where you're not actively buying. And try to put the risk in the places where you're actively buying, such that if there's a dip, you're at least continuing to acquire shares less expensively during that period of time. Nice. I mean, this is a little bit oversimplified, but the reality is every investor has some accounts where they're doing different things at the same time. And especially in that age range, where you're thinking about how am I going to create income and how soon am I going to need income? And we'll talk about, the post-retirees momentarily. It's a whole different animal entirely. But for pre-retirees and folks who are within that, say 10-year window, I think it's important to start segregating assets a little bit and treating each account like it's its own infrastructure. It's its own universe almost.
Mm. With its own goal, with its own risk criteria and all of that. Yeah, I get that. I mean, I think that just the number of people that I've spoken to recently that are in that hurry to get their capital growth in the last few years. Say, the gentleman I was talking to the other day had 7 years to go, he said. And just the way that he had lots of high risk type stocks, and he was looking, because what we do is quite conservative. So he was actually looking for something that was a lot higher risk. And we say to people, we're not here to tell you what to do. We can't provide personal financial advice, but you do realise what you're doing is really high risk. And I give them a story of what happened to this gentleman before the GFC, how he'd worked hard. He'd actually had a financial advisor. The advisor had given him a product that had a huge amount of money had gone into a geared fund. And so, of course, pre-GFC, he was making a bucket load on this fund. But when the GFC hit, it just went the other way, and he just lost pretty much everything in that geared fund. And it meant that he had to delay his retirement 7 years. So, what you're saying is exactly right. But he did have money in different baskets, but he just had money in the wrong things for the timing. So how do you tell someone to accept, you've only got this amount of time left and you shouldn't be doing that?
Well, you can tell anyone that. Some people will choose to believe you, and some people will choose to do it themselves. And you can't save everyone. So,
no.
I mean, let's face it. People who come to any of us for advice are always free to take that advice or not to take that advice. They're seeking recommendations. They're seeking some wisdom. Maybe they're seeking validation. Maybe they want somebody to tell them what they want to hear, because that always feels good for some reason. So I think you can tell somebody that the rain is coming, but if they choose not to take a raincoat, you can't pin it to them.
Yes.
You can do everything you can without trying to make it sound like the sky is falling. You don't want to be a doomsayer all the time, but recognizing that the level of risk that people take as they get closer to retirement starts to get really frightening. And we've all seen it. We saw it in 2000 with Y2K. We saw it in GFC.
Yep.
And we're going to see it again here. We saw it with real estate. And we're going to see it again. I mean, there's a tendency for people to have some recency bias and see what just happened, and wow, it was a great year, so it's going to be another great year. And while there are lots of strategies, and a lot of them are nothing more than anecdotes, really, there are lots of strategies around that. I would say the best thing to do is understand, how will you handle a 10 or 20 or 30 or 40% downturn?
Good question.
And if the answer is, I will be working an extra 10 years, are you okay with that? If you're willing to accept that risk, that's fine. But if it's a risk you can't bear for one reason or another, you must pass that risk. And you can pass that risk with insured vehicles. You can pass that risk with more conservative options. You can pass that risk with extra cash. But you must pass some risks that you can't afford to bear. If you can afford to bear them, then you're making an educated decision to take that risk on and say, you know what, if the market goes bad, I'll just work more. And if you're comfortable with that, then that's your choice. You're adult people. There is still free will. But, Janine, to your point, there's a whole swath of the population who are going to ask for your opinion, and if they don't like it, they're not going to follow your suggestion, and that you can't protect them.
Well, we don't give them suggestions because we can't give personal financial advice. So we just put it into stories because other people have been in that situation before. So we share some of those stories with them, or just talk about what the market's likely to do based on our forecasts.
I think it's a case that they ask the question, and because we don't give them the answer that they want. Because they're wanting us to, and I have this philosophy, your inability to plan doesn't constitute an emergency in my case. And we get people like that all the time, that they get to that, retirement age or a few years out of retirement, and then they realise they need another 200,000, 300,000, 400,000, and they go, I've got this much money, can you make me 20% a year for the next 3 years? And I go, no, it's just not going to happen. Right. I can't guarantee that's going to happen, because you haven't planned. Now you're asking me to take high risk with your money. And so it's a real challenge for us to get that across to people. So just to finish up, can we talk about retirees?
Yeah, retirees are the first group who are truly sellers. And if there's something we learned from the GFC, it's that buyers made out wonderfully by sticking to their guns. Holders lost 5 to 7 years. Sellers, some of them will never recover. They haven't to this day, a decade plus later. The reason for that is that now if you think about your money as an orchard, every year you're trying to pick fruit from your trees. And if you have a healthy orchard, every year you're going to pick more fruit and you're going to live. And ideally, you're also planting more trees and everything's great. When markets go south, what happens is some of the trees, you sometimes have to chop branches off. And when you do that in order to close the gap, because markets are down, that means you're going to bear less fruit next year and less the year after that and less the year after that. And eventually, that's the recipe for running out of money.
Yep.
So for people who are sellers, it's really important to understand your income strategy. And there are 3 that we use, and it depends almost exclusively on the level, the percentage that you need to live on of your net worth. If your nest egg is $1 million and you need $30,000 a year, that's 3%. In a lot of cases, you can do that for the next 100 years and be okay. But if you needed $80,000 from that same million and it was 8%, it's a recipe for disaster. You can't possibly do that on an ongoing basis. So we will encourage people to use a strategy, either a total return strategy because there's plenty of money and therefore it almost doesn't matter because their needs are so low. There's asset segregation. We talked a little bit about that, where you have some accounts where you're sellers and those accounts should be basically cash. Like know what you're going to live on for the next 5 years so that the rest of it can endure. And then the last is some type of either annuity strategy or some type of insured option where you can trade some of your principal for income that you can't outlive.
Yep.
And people don't like to think about that. They're expensive and they're cumbersome and they're challenging. And there are lots of reasons why people hate them. And a lot of them are well-founded. But if you haven't planned and the emergency is here and you need the income and can't afford that kind of risk, sometimes you put yourself in that position. So I think for folks who are 70 plus or who are already retired, who aren't making more money in a way through work, but they're instead relying on their principal to pay their bills, you have to have some of that money deliberately set aside in a measured way to pay the bills for the next 5 or even 10 years. Beyond that, you can write out anything.
Yep.
Well, Eric Brotman, I wish I could say let's keep talking for another hour, but we've run out of time again today, and I always enjoy chatting with you. But before we go, can you tell everybody how they can find out more about you and actually buy that awesome book of yours?
Yeah, thank you. Brotmanmedia.com. If you go to that site, you'll find our books and our online courses and our podcasts and a whole bunch of resources. Many of them are free and available to the public, and hopefully folks will check it out.
Fantastic. Well, Eric Brotman, thank you for being on Talking Wealth, and we look forward to chatting with you again really, really soon. You take care.
Thanks. You do the same. Take care.
Bye, Eric.
For more information on our guest in today's episode, visit the link on screen right now. For more Talking Wealth, visit flix.net, click on the On Demand section, and then click on Talking Wealth under the Finance section. That's FLIXX.net. Or visit wealthwithin.com.au, where we have hundreds of informational videos, live shows, and Talking Wealth podcasts. Talking Wealth was voted number 3 in stock market podcasts globally in 2018 by FeedSpot. For more information on our courses, visit wealthwithin.com.au.